I played over 30 hours of Diablo 4 and really enjoyed the changes to character progression. I think Blizzard is really nailing the atmosphere by returning to the series' darker and more grounded tone, but are also addressing many of the shortcomings from Diablo 3 in a big way. Also, a huge thanks to Blizzard for letting me play through this very early build. Obviously, this isn't final and lots of things can still change until launch, but the B-roll they provided reflects really well some of the stuff I was able to do and see during my time with the game. And yeah, Diablo 4 immediately impresses with its darker and more grounded tone, but also goes even deeper with its RPG mechanics. After picking your class, you are now presented with a character customizer that doesn't disappoint. The faces look sharp, highly detailed, and with plenty of options for face, body, hair, and color, accessories, and markings likewise. I was even able to recreate Kratos with it from God of War, which I immediately did on the Barbarian class. In this build, we only had access to 3 of the 5 starting classes, so my impressions will mainly focus on the Rogue, Sorcerer, and Barbarian, with the Druid and Necromancer being unavailable. And you might think your character's face doesn't matter that much given the camera's placement, but it definitely grows on you since many cutscenes are rendered in real time in the environments you're in. Even more so, the transmog system, which you can access very early at any wardrobe in any town, will store and then let you switch between any of weapons or armor skins that you've unlocked so far. On top of that, Diablo 4 also features a preset menu that lets you save your preferred looks so that you can quickly change between them at any time. Unfortunately, we did not have access to the cosmetic shop, neither the PvP in this build, so I can't really say much about them, but after asking the devs, they confirmed that there will be one in the final version, but it will be purely cosmetic and not provide any extra powers. But the gameplay and especially character progression is where I spent most of my time analyzing and basically just losing myself into. The combat feels impactful, even more so than Diablo 3. There's great feedback from enemies, and even starting skills can feel devastating, which means it doesn't take too long until you start feeling powerful with most of the classes. There are several layers to the progression of your character besides loot. This includes the skill tree that we'll talk in just a moment, the Paragon system at level 50, the newly added Codex of Power, and the Specializations, most of which, with the exception of the Paragon levels, I was able to play with in the beta. With that in mind, let's take a deep dive into the skill trees. I'm a big fan of this change and I'm super glad Blizzard finally went back to a proper skill tree and not the menus that were presented in Diablo 3. And while it's not as convoluted as, for example, Path of Exile, it does leave a lot of room for choices. In this build I played, the max level cap was 25 out of the max 100 that we'll have in the final release, but that still gave me enough points to check out most of the active and some of the passive skills in them. The skill tree is made out of nodes and every class has 7 of these nodes. It starts with the basic skills in the first node, then the core for the second one, and from the third and onwards it becomes even more specialized with more powerful and interesting abilities. All classes have up to 7 nodes, with each node featuring up to 5 separate active and sometimes even passive abilities, as well as 3 modifiers for each one of these. For instance, Rogue already starts with options for both melee and ranged playstyles right from the first node, while Sorcerer can choose between fire, lightning, or spells as well. You can then further improve these skills by investing another point to get their enhanced version, with the final 2 modifiers being given to you as a choice. Either pick one or the other. Usually these modifiers will provide interesting effects to the skills that they affect, so you could choose to make an attack do more AoE by jumping to additional targets, apply debuffs to enemies like bleeds and burns, or provide other boons like crit damage and even stuns. One great early on example was the Rogue's Heartseeker basic ranged attack, which you can modify to also ricochet to additional targets. There's other similar options for Sorcerer's Firebolt too, and plenty more in the final game. As you spend skill points to unlock these abilities and their modifiers, you also feel a line that connects and eventually unlocks the next node in the sequence that will have even more powerful skills and modifiers to invest into. As I've said, there's 7 of these nodes in total for each class, with the final one being an ultimate node that will let you choose between a handful of powerful unique options for that specific class. We'll go over a more extensive breakdown of different class builds in a different video, but one early build I really liked for the Rogue was Shadow Imbuement that works great for both range and melee options. This lets you imbue all your attacks with shadow damage, which debuffs the enemies and makes them explode, completely destroying large groups of enemies and bosses likewise. In fact, I found Rogue to be probably the best class in terms of becoming strongest the fastest out of all the 3 options we had in the demo, with the Sorcerer not being too far off, but it did lack a bit in the defenses that the Rogue had, so there was a difference, but I think it will all like just even out as you progress more and more and level up, with different other builds becoming more powerful in the end game. But there were many more options, and the highlight was that any one class can play with vastly different playstyles depending on what you choose to invest your points into. Sorcerer, as I've said, can choose between different elementals like ice, fire and lightning. Rogue can go melee or range with options for dual daggers, bows and crossbows. Meanwhile, Barbarian can carry 4 weapons at the same time for the first time ever, investing in straight up melee damage, bleed, stuns, or even more defensive builds that can take advantage of different types of weapons depending on which one you choose. Now, the next part of the progression is going to be the specializations. On top of the skill trees, all of the classes have something called specializations or expertise, which are basically mechanics on top of the skill trees that can influence how you play with that class. Think of these as separate playstyles where each one of them lets you further augment and build upon what the skill tree already gives you. For example, Rogue has access to combo points starting at around level 7, then Inner Sight at around level 20 or Preparation at level 30 to choose between. The first one introduces the combo point mechanic where you can guarantee these points in combat and then spend them on skills for extra effects. Inner Sight, on the other hand, marks targets in combat, and if you defeat them, you'll fill a gauge that will give you unlimited energy for a few seconds. I found Inner Sight to be absolutely overpowered against bosses, as you'd constantly get infinite energy since you were only ever hitting the same marked target. For the Sorcerer, I got to unlock a passive mechanic called Enchantment slots. This would let me slot different active abilities in a different tab, which would then auto-cast those specific skills for different effects. Like, for example, slotting in the Blizzard skill would auto-cast a Blizzard that followed me every 15 seconds for 4 seconds, or having the Meteor ability to now randomly cause meteors to fall on targets that were affected by burn, and so on. Pretty much all of the active abilities from the skill trees, with the exception of the ultimate ones, would also have an enchantment slot, like active version as well, that you could slot in for different effects. To unlock these different specializations, you have to complete different class missions that start at around level 7, and then you'll progressively unlock more as you progress through the game and level up. Now, there's also a third way of getting extra powers, and this is with the newly added Codex of Power, which is kind of like a combination between the runes and the new modifiers that we got in Diablo 4. This gives you access to certain enchantments called aspects that you can apply on weapons and armor to gain special boons. For example, early on I got one that would give me a protective bubble every 10 seconds, which was crazy good as it would absorb a lot of damage before breaking. But there's way more split into different categories like offensive, defensive, utility and so on for each of the classes, and even special ones that provide certain buffs to abilities or mechanics from the skill tree. And what's awesome is that you find these by completing dungeons. If you look on the map, this will be indicated on the dungeon icon, or you can also check that info in the Codex so that you're constantly incentivized to go out there and explore and especially complete dungeons. Once you do get them, they unlock account-wide, and you can even unlock the ones from other classes, so you only have to ever unlock these once and then have them for an alt or for your current class as well. For example, there was an aspect for the Rogue that would automatically have a chance to cast a second Flurry when already using Flurry against targets affected by the Shadow effect. So this would make like the whole build completely overpowered, but again, I will talk about that in a completely different video. On top of that, there's also a second set of legendary aspects that are much stronger than their versions from the Codex of Power, but this time around you get them from unique pieces of gear. So this is like a gear set that's above legendary quality. If they drop, you can then bring them at an occultist, extract that special effect, that legendary aspect out of it, so that you can apply it to a different piece of gear later on. And that brings me to the next and final point, which is the fact that the world of Diablo 4 feels big but never empty, and most important, it feels very rewarding. Even more so, I was surprised by how well the game performed given how incredibly early this build was. This isn't to say that my first impression is indicative of the full product, but if this is what we're starting with when strictly talking about performance, I'm already impressed. The map immediately feels more open, which in part is made possible because the whole game is open world, plus the transition between zones is seamless. And I can't stress this enough, but the map of Sanctuary, which is what this world is called by the way, feels big, sometimes overwhelming, but never empty. Everything felt interconnected in a way that leaves room to approach both the main story and the side content in a non-linear way. If you have 3 main story missions, for example, but don't want to do them now and instead would much rather go ahead and give this cool dungeon a try, there's totally an option to do that, or you can go in and do some side quests, open world events, and a ton of other stuff with almost no restriction and at your own pace. The demo was restricted to only 2 of the 5 zones, which included the prologue area and the fractured peaks, but even these included a ton of content, dozens of dungeons, even strongholds that you could conquer, and many active events that would also reset every hour and every day. And I'm pretty excited for what Diablo 4 has in store. It definitely seems to hit the mark with most of the things that I was not happy about in Diablo 3. Also, I really like the design changes, the new more grounded feeling, and just everything I've seen so far in the demo gets me super hyped for it. Of course, also cautiously optimistic because it remains to see how they will approach microtransactions and how heavily they will monetize the game, considering that Immortal was, kind of like a hit or miss for many people. This is pretty much it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.